Hello, everyone, and welcome to Spirit of Truth Church for this talk on biblical manhood and womanhood, silent in the churches, on 1 Corinthians 14, 33 through 36. So first, I'd like to just say thank you so much for joining us here tonight. I am getting over being sick, so bear with me. I may need to breathe a little bit more. My voice may not be quite where it needs to be, and my energy might be a little low. But it's also going to be a bit of a shorter lecture tonight. Just the topic at hand, I think we can cover it in a shorter time. And so I hope you enjoy. I hope this helps make sense of some fairly difficult verses at times. So first, I want to start by way of referring to what we covered 2 weeks ago, which was in 1 Corinthians 11, 2 through 26. Where Paul is going to allow women to pray and prophesy in church, in the congregation, with certain restrictions. Now, the reason I bring this up is because these verses are going to say, Paul simply says, women should be silent in churches. Okay? He clearly didn't think that in all situations. To just assume that that meant blanket women have to be absolutely dead silent in churches would be incorrect. As just a few chapters earlier in the same letter, he's talking about them praying and prophesying. Now, the question we have here first, there's a couple of different questions we have to ask. The question we have here first is what we call a text critical question. So some people are going to say that verses 34 through 36, which let's go ahead actually and read those now so we can actually have this. 1 Corinthians 14, 33 through 36. It goes, actually we'll back it up one verse so you can get the full context here. And the prophets' spirits are under the control of the prophets, since God is not a God of disorder, but of peace. As in all the churches of the saints, the women should be silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but should be submissive, as the law also says. And if they want to learn something, they should ask their own husbands at home, for it is disgraceful for a woman to speak in the church meeting. Did the word of God originate from you, or did it come to you only? Now, one thing that people dispute is the link between 33a, 33b, and 34. In other words, it says, in the prophets' spirits are under the control of the prophets, since God is not a God of disorder, but of peace. And some people say there's just no link between that and, as in all the churches of the saints, the women should be silent in the churches. And so this kind of gets into this text critical question, where some people see 34 36 as a late they call it a late gloss of no relevance in establishing Pauline theology. Okay, so they'll say it's some. Again, they'll use the same technique to remove other verses that restrict women as well. That if it's a later gloss or even a later edition. But all manuscripts are going to contain this passage. So some are now arguing that it was an interpolation. In other words, that it's found in the present location, or after in the Western text type after verse 40. So again, this can move in the Western text type after 40. Now the Western text type is typically not a text type that we go to for reliability per se. We use mostly the Alexandrian text type and the Byzantine text type. Alexandrian probably about 70% of the time, Byzantine about 30% of the time. The Western text type is not one we go to often. In the Codex Fuldensis, it has them after 40 and the margin after 33. So it does jump around, but it only does so in later manuscripts. Okay. Now, Gordon Fee is going to argue for something called transcriptional probability. Okay. And there's such a thing called the Bengal's first principle, and this is the form of the text that best explains the origin of all other forms is most likely the original. Okay. So the thought then would be is that Paul wrote the words after 33, and then someone moved them to after 40. Another option is Paul wrote them after 40 and someone moved them to 33. And then the next option is Paul didn't write them, they were an early marginal gloss or later editor's edition, written in the margin and inserted 2 points. So again, some people are basically saying that these verses that women being silent churches were like later edits, later additions by editors and things like that. So what are some problems with this though? It'd be very hard to get this into every manuscript. And again, most glosses explain rather than make things harder. And in this case, it would actually make it harder. Again, being they're in every manuscript and then they only move around later would seem to indicate that they were indeed unique to Paul, written by Paul, and written after verse 33. So that idea, the transcriptional probability, again, that they were added later, not really going to fly here. There's also intrinsic probability. So one can make the best sense of the structure of Paul's argument without including these sentences. So that's the other argument, is remove them and then the text makes more sense. Okay, but this is against the principle, by the way, of lectio difficilior, portior, which is that the difficult reading is more preferable. Now, that's not always the case. There could be other reasons why the difficult reading is not preferable. I mean, it's possible, but typically you want the more difficult reading, given all else being equal. And you only overthrow this when there's external evidence is very strongly against it. So these verses stand in obvious contradiction to 11:2 through 16, where it's assumed that without reproof that women pray and prophesy in the assembly. Okay, so Fee then takes that they are not allowed to speak as an absolute statement that cannot be reconciled with 11:2 through 16. But seeing this as an absolute disjunction is problematic. So again, doesn't quite fully make sense if you say they can't be reconciled. Also, yes, there are presence of hapax legomena, which is expressions that only occur once. So we have sort of these issues with the verses that people are going to bring up. So what are some, given that these are some of the things that they mention, and again, I would argue that the verses do belong there. Okay, I think they are original Paul, and I think they do belong there. So what are, for example, the unsatisfying interpretations? Well, so say, for example, we grant authenticity after verse 33 and move on to interpretations. And again, I don't think Fee has good enough ground to reject those verses. I think they should be there. The first interpretation would be that the demand for silence is an absolute rule. Okay, again, these are bad or unsatisfying interpretations. Only the silence verses have reference to the public assembly, and the former deal with a home or small group gathering. So this is what they would say. The silence verse is the public assembly, the home or small group gathering is women can prophesy and pray in public. The problem, though, is that Paul thinks of prophecy primarily as a revelation from God delivered through believers in the context of the church. So it should be in the context of the church, not necessarily just in a private gathering. Additionally, there's no good evidence for distinctions between smaller groups and the larger church. The language seems to suggest a church concern, not a private or small group gathering in the earlier verses. Excuse me. The immediate and succeeding verses are devoted to an ordinance for the assembly, so the context is very much the church assembly. The preceding verses don't restrict to the private home or small group. And again, the reference to head coverings in 11, it would seem ridiculous to extend that to just private prayer. And then there's also the universality of the promise of the Spirit in Joel at Pentecost that goes to both men and women. So that interpretation just doesn't seem to hold water. The second interpretation is that it is simply an absolute rule, taking the permission granted in the later passage to be a mere concession. Women pray and prophesy with extreme reluctance for places that cannot manage to submit properly. But again, there's problems there because you have Paul essentially granting this, and you see this in other places as well. So that really doesn't fit. Third interpretation is that it's a contradiction, but again, there's doctrinal issues with that, and it's odd that would even be within the same book on such pronounced themes. The fourth interpretation is that the subordination Paul had in mind is not of women to men, but of women to the order of worship, which he is establishing. But then the question would be, why are women singled out, as opposed to not men as well? And then the fifth interpretation is Paul is talking about wives only, not women in general. But that also is just very odd. That'd be a very odd way to read things. So what if we try to find an interpretation constrained by context? Okay. So Paul has been requiring that the church in Corinth carefully weigh the prophecies presented to it. Okay, this is what's been happening. And women can participate in these prophecies. But what if the whole point of this is that they can't participate in the oral weighing of the prophecies? That's not permitted in any of the churches. In that connection, they're not allowed to speak, as the law says. In the Old Testament scriptures, he's again referring to the created order. The submission of the wife to the husband could not be maintained if the wife participated. This would lead to women sitting in judgment over men. And Paul refused to permit any woman to enjoy church-recognized teaching authority over men, as in 1 Timothy 2:11. A careful weighing of prophecy falls under this. Remember, they had to, if a prophecy was uttered or tongues were uttered or something, they had to have an interpreter, and they also had to have the weigh in, and the elders had to weigh in, and people had to weigh in on this. And so again, the question would be in the context, if we're looking at the verses right there, it does actually seem like it's probably referring to this issue of weighing in on prophecies. Women can inquire about prophecies and learn at home. Again, this interpretation fits the flow of chapter 14 to maintain order in the enjoyment of grace gifts or spiritual gifts. This interpretation also makes sense in the structure of the passage. Again, chapter 14 is dominated by discussion of tongues and prophecy. Verse 26 is concerned with the practical guidelines for the ordering of these two gifts, tongues and prophecy. 30 through 33a is an uttering of prophecies. 33b through 36 would be an evaluation of prophecies. So again, this seems like it's got a lot going for it. This interpretation that, well, it's probably just referring to the judgment of prophecies. Now, the major objection is it seems inconsistent for Paul to permit women to prophesy and then to forbid them to weigh prophecies. That's sort of the major issue. But this carries little weight, though. If prophecy doesn't have the same authority status that the great writing prophecy Old Testament enjoyed. In other words, prophecy of the New Testament doesn't seem to carry with it the same weight as prophecy, for example, Old Testament prophet in the nation of Israel. Prophecy in the New Testament is a very broad category. In common church life, it was recognized by spirit-prompted utterance, but with no guarantee of divine authority in every detail, and therefore not only in need of evaluation, but necessarily inferior in authority to the deposit of truth represented by the Apostle Paul. We see that in 1 Corinthians 14:29 and 37-38. Additionally, teaching we see is elevated above prophecy. And this teaching, I would argue if correct, is for our good. And so what do we have here? Well, we essentially have this interesting situation where it truly does seem like what's happening here is women just simply aren't allowed to sit in judgment over men in church situations. And as a result, people are going to be uttering prophecies. People would normally think, oh, well, men and women can utter prophecies, therefore men and women can evaluate them. And the answer actually would be, well, no, because the evaluation of a prophecy is essentially taking on that authoritative role, determinately saying this is okay or this is not, essentially instructing the church. And so women wouldn't be allowed to sit in judgment over men in that situation. And most likely that's what this is referring to. And that's cool because, one, it does finally kind of put to rest this whole issue of women have to be dead silent in churches, which is ridiculous. But two, it also fits very consistently with the idea of men or women can't sit in seats of authority over men in the church circumstance. And so it actually works really well both ways. It makes sense in the whole flow of the passage, which is about spiritual gifts and prophecy. So that's really what I wanted to cover tonight. Honestly, like I said, I wasn't feeling too great. I sound terrible. Yeah, I was debating on putting this off, and then I was like, it's short enough that I figured I'd just do it. But that's kind of how it is. So, but yeah, this is all we're doing tonight. Is just a little short thing on those verses. I hope this cleared some things up. I think it is much more restricted than just a blank reading of that passage. You have to read it in context, and you see that actually it's really, again, that whole women having authority over men issue. Thanks so much. Yeah, I'm glad I made it for a minute too. All right. Well, anywho, I'm going to go get some rest. Still try and rest up and try and recover. But thank you so much for joining us here tonight, Spirit of Truth Church. I hope you have a wonderful day, and we'll see you not this coming Thursday, but the Thursday after that. All right. Have a great night, everybody.